Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Welcome back to our lectures on the history of international politics. I will share my screen to show you the syllabus. We will start today the substantive analysis of the evolution of world order, and more specifically the first part of it, that is to say the material dimension, the evolution of international systems, of successive international systems. And our first period that we will have a look at, chapter 2 in other words, goes from 1492 to 1648. That is to say, from the end of the European Middle Ages, 1492, the discovery of America by Christopher Columbus, we'll come back to this, to 1648, the end of the 30 Years' War, the Westphalian treaties, the Westphalian peace, and this period, kind of transition period, we'll come back to this, witnessed the emergence of a global international system. When I use the term global, I mean worldwide, planetary international system. Last point we saw, ladies and gentlemen, in our introduction, justified why I chose 1492 as the starting point of my analysis of international history and of world orders in international history. The reason was the following one: there were no international system and no international society before 1492. There were no international system, no international society, because there were no nation states in the somehow modern meaning of the term, definition of the term. There were no nation states because empires were then a prevailing form of political organization to which human societies resorted. This was the case in ancient times. It was the case in the Middle Ages, beyond Europe and also in Europe. So what then was the situation, ladies and gentlemen, before 1492? Let's go a little bit into the details in Europe. The Middle Ages in Europe began after the definitive collapse of the Roman Empire in the mid or in the second half of the 5th century, when the Roman Empire was invaded by notably Germanic tribes coming from the northeast. They were driven westwards by the Huns, Attila's Huns, and Attila, who died in 453. Attila's death, the year 453, is sometimes considered to be the starting point of the Middle Ages. An alternative year is 476, when another king from the Huns, Odoacer, deposed the last Roman emperor. The last Roman emperor, and I should immediately specify the last Western emperor, because in the East, the so-called Eastern Roman Empire, which became Byzantium, the Byzantine Empire survived 1 millennium up to precisely 1453, when the Ottomans conquered Constantinople. So the Western Empire collapsed, and this opened a new period, the Middle Ages in Europe. Medieval Europe was called by the then elites Latin Christendom. Latin Christendom was the term used to express the common perception of the then European elites, I should say Western European elites. Why Latin Christendom? Because the Latin faith, the Christian faith, and the Latin language characterized all the people, and more specifically the peoples, and more specifically their elites that were living in Western Europe. The Christian faith institutionalized at the Holy See, today's Vatican. We come back to these elements, which are normative elements, in our second part, regarding the more material dimension, which we are interested in today's chapter and in this part of my lectures, regarding the material dimension, that is to say, the distribution of power resources among major units, and the consequences upon the stability and instability, upon the risks of war and the chances of peace. What we can say is that during roughly 3 centuries, disorder prevailed in Western Europe until the Frankish king Charlemagne managed to unify somehow significant territory, including today's France, today's Germany, and the northern and Austria, and the northern part of Italy, in his Frankish Empire. He was crowned emperor by the then Pope in 800, Christmas Day, 800, very precisely. However, his empire was dissolved, and more specifically was divided after his death. In 814, it was divided in 3 parts because he had 3 sons. The western part of his empire corresponded roughly to the 3 quarters of Western France nowadays. The central parts, the left bank of the Rhine River, plus southeast France and North Italy, and the eastern part of the empire, right on the right bank of the Rhine River, corresponded roughly to today's Germany and Austria and Czechoslovakia. It became gradually the Holy Roman Empire, called Holy Roman Empire of the German nation, which lasted almost 9 centuries, up to 1806, when it was dissolved by Napoleon. This is important regarding the evolution of these 3 entities, whereas France, and we'll come back to this, managed to become a unified, centralized, territorial nation state at the end of the Middle Ages. Italy and Germany had to wait up to the second half of the 19th century before unifying. Anyway, let's come back to the evolution of Europe and the European units. On the one hand, the populations in Germany, today's Germany, what corresponds to the territory of today's Germany, in the territory of today's France, in the territory of today's Italy, but also in the territory of today's England, after the conquest by William the Conqueror, Duke of Normandy, conquest in 1066, the Battle of Hastings, and Spain, at least those territories that were not controlled by the Arabs, by the Muslims. We'll come back to this too. All the elites living in these territories believed, had the perception, and held the discourse consisting in claiming that there existed a kind of Christian commonwealth beyond the different peoples, Spaniards, the French, the Frankish, Italians and Germans, etc. There was a Christian commonwealth. Respublica Christiana was the then Latin name. And they also believed, of course, in institutions such as personal links of vassalage, such as territorial fiefs. The different noblemen controlled territorial fiefs of various sizes, depending on whether they were knights or earls or dukes or kings. And all these secular lords accepted the political authority of the Christian law. The Christian law, which was defined all at once by the Pope, that is to say, the spiritual authority, and the emperor, the Holy Emperor, the secular authority. There was no distinction at that time between the secular domain and the religious or the spiritual domain. So this was, I would say, the predominant perception and discourse. The reality, however, ladies and gentlemen, was somehow different. The prevailing practice was different. Why? Because the genuine political authority was fragmented among many local lords. Though, to quote Henry Kissinger, Europe had its Holy Roman Emperor, just as China had its emperor and Islam had its caliph, though this was the case in the discourse and in the perception. In the reality, there were dozens of political rulers, landlords, who exercised authority almost without anyone telling them what to do, without any clear-cut hierarchy among them. So they were fighting against each other to increase, of course, the territory that they were controlling. And they were fighting against the authority of the Pope and of the Emperor in order to increase their authority within the territories that they were controlling. So there was a kind of contradiction, ladies and gentlemen. On the one hand, we had the idea and the ideal of the Christian Commonwealth, which represented the equivalent of St. Augustine's City of God, the successor of the Roman Empire, which had turned Christian roughly 3 centuries after Jesus Christ. But on the other hand, we had the reality consisting in a plurality of political rulers competing with each other. So on the one hand, there was a hierarchy, a proclaimed hierarchy, the idea of Europe. And on the other hand, there was the reality of anarchy, no authority above, no effective authority, anarchy in the etymological meaning of absence of any somehow credible central authority above the units. And logically then, during this kind of transition, since the two principles coexisted during this kind of period of transition, gradually the anarchical principle, the logic of anarchy, ended up prevailing over the logic of hierarchy. Gradually, more and more lords at the head of political units, political entities, managed to become genuinely independent from any political or spiritual authority, and thus they permitted anarchy to prevail over hierarchy, the principle of the past. This happened when the first territorial nation states emerged. This was the case, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, in Spain. It was the case in Spain thanks to the so-called Reconquista. Reconquista, that is to say, the Spanish kings managed to reconquer the territory of the Spanish or the Iberian Peninsula that had been occupied from the 8th century onwards by the Arab Moors, by the Muslims. And this Reconquista ended successfully, very precisely in 1492, when the last Arabs were chased, were expelled from Granada. The Spaniards, the Catholic kings, because it was a couple of Catholic kings, Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabel of Castile, they managed also, or they decided also, to expel the Jews who settled down in North Africa. So Spain was the first European entity that managed to become genuinely unified under the control of one effective political ruler, the Spanish crown. France, more or less at the same time, managed to do so too at the 11th, 12th centuries. French king only controlled the region that corresponds to today's Paris, Normandy, Brittany a bit later, the center of France. And gradually, the French kings managed to get rid of regional rivals in Toulouse, in Bordeaux, etc., etc. So the French king de facto controlled a very significant territory, which allowed him, though he called himself the very Christian king, which allowed him to get rid of the authority both of the Pope and of the Holy Roman Emperor. Last but not least, England. Last but not least, England too managed to become a territorial nation state. Also thanks to its insular position, to its geographical position. After the Battle of Hastings in 1066, the Norman kings and the Plantagenet kings who ruled England made royal authority more and more effective. And they ended up to create the Anglican Church in order also to set themselves free from any religious authority coming from Rome. These kings were very ambitious, and they fought also on the continent in France, in the region of the southwest, notably in Bordeaux. The so-called 100 Years' War against the French king, and they lost this war. The last battle took place in Castillon-la-Bataille, which is a town, ladies and gentlemen, close to Bordeaux, was something like 80 or 90 kilometers east of Bordeaux. So the English were defeated by the French, and therefore England decided to no longer be physically present on the European continent. England withdrew on its island, and it started adopting what was to become its diplomatic military strategy called offshore balancing strategy. That is to say that from its insular position, rather than being physically present on the European continent, it just intervened temporarily in wars on the European continent in order to try to maintain the balance, in order to prevent any continental state from becoming too powerful. Because this, such a European continental power would have constituted a threat to England's security and a bit later to England's power and richness. This offshore balancing strategy was adopted after England's defeat in the 100 Years' War in the midst of the 15th century. The 100 Years' War is also the war of the French Jeanne d'Arc, Joan of Arc. And it lasted almost 5 full centuries up to World War II. So England, because of its awareness that it had an interest in not being too involved on the European continent, England did not, I would say, directly participate in the then international system, which therefore was merely European and more specifically continental. And since England, the third major nation states that emerged in the late Middle Ages, did not participate in the international system, this international system of our periods here from 1492 onwards was dominated by two major powers, or it was dominated by the struggle among these two major powers, Spain and France. Two major political entities emerged on the continent. They were nominally members of the Christian Respublica, of the Christian Commonwealth, what was common to all the Western European Christians. But as a matter of fact, they were politically independent. That is to say, they were able to no more listen to what the Pope or the Emperor told them, what to do and what not to do. The stage, thus, was set for the first rivalry, and I would say for the first cycle of major wars, the so-called wars of the Italian Renaissance, or the Italian Wars, lasting from 1492 to 1521, and according to some historians, until even 1559. Wars of Italy, why? Because the first immediate issue at stake were the Italian city-states. or the Italian principalities. Here we have the map of the then existing Italy, which was not Italy. Tons of different city-states, territories, principalities, independent from each other, yet to some extent forming a kind of regional system and even a regional society, given the Latin or the Italian civilization of the Renaissance. The wars of the Italian Renaissance form a cycle because they lasted pretty long, of course, and also because the major powers were involved, and in this case, Spain and France. And therefore, this cycle of major wars has to be distinguished from the wars that had taken place in the previous decades and centuries. These wars had almost always been bilateral ones. For instance, the English against the French during the 100 Years' War. A major war, ladies and gentlemen, throughout my lectures, is a war, therefore I consider it, together with the power cycle theorists, as a cycle of major wars, is a war where the major powers of a period are involved, and where therefore the order of the system is at stake. I share here the idea of Kenneth Walls in saying that this cycle of major wars constitute the definitive turning point of the gradual shifts between the two ordering principles. These are Waltzian terms, the two ordering principles, the two opposed ordering principles, hierarchy on the one hand, anarchy on the other hand. Hierarchy had prevailed throughout the Middle Ages because of the belief in a Christian commonwealth. I told you this some minutes ago. The belief in a Christian unity and in an authority. Anarchy, in the meaning of absence of any central authority above units, will start prevailing after this cycle of Italian wars from 1492 to 1521 or 1559. I come back to a point I already mentioned. It is a kind of period of transition. The definitive turning point will be 1648, that is to say, the end of the 30 Years' War, the Westphalian Peace, the Westphalian treaties. But as early as during this first period, from 1492 to 1648, the anarchical ordering principle, no authority above states, will gradually prevail, progressively prevail over the hierarchical principle, at least in the practice. So Italy, let's come back to the empirical historical reality, was divided into 12, 15, 20 entities, as many republics as the princedoms. The most important one, Venice, Milan, Savoy, that is to say Torino, Florence, Naples, the Papal States, which were all at once a political authority and a religious authority, of course. These Italian units were nominally part of the Holy Roman Empire, at least some of them, and more specifically Milan, Savoy, and Florence. And therefore, they were more or less controlled by the Pope. But politically speaking, or the Pope claimed, had the ambition to control them. In the reality, however, the political authority belonged to the local rulers. All the more so that the Italian states or units were at that time the richest in Europe. You may know that the banking system was invented in Florence by the Medici, and notably Lorenzo il Magnifico, Lawrence the Magnificent, the best known member of the Medici family or dynasty. And being rich, the Italian rulers could establish mercenary armies and pay soldiers to wage their wars in order to maintain their independence against the rival entities and against the Pope. So Italy was a kind of regional system, and the different wars managed to maintain a kind of equilibrium, a kind of balance between the 5-6 major units. But this balance was threatened after a domestic political event in one of them, more specifically in Milan. In Milan, the new ruler was Ludovico Sforza at the end of the 15th century. He had been a former condottiere. A condottiere was a captain of the mercenary troops, of the mercenary armies. And he had come to power by getting rid of the legitimate aristocratic ruler by a coup. And so he was rejected by the other Italian rulers of Florence, of Venice, of Savoy, of Naples, etc. So what did he do to try to consolidate his domestic authority in the city-state of Milan? What did he do? He appealed to the French. He appealed to the French to help him, to support him against his Italian rivals. Charles VIII, the then French king, sent troops, but in doing so, of course, he interfered in domestic, inner Italian affairs, threatening to break up the existing balance, because by supporting Milan, by being supported by France, Milan was likely to defeat Florence, Naples, etc. So what did the other entities do? And first and foremost, Naples, they appealed to Spain. And so did the Pope, because Spain at that time was a very Catholic country. The kings themselves called themselves, the Spanish kings called themselves Rey Mas Católico, the very Catholic king, as opposed to the very Christian king, the French king. So due to a domestic trouble, the risk of civil war in Milan, at the origin, a kind of civil war in Milan ended up in what we could call an international war because of the interference of the two major powers of that period, Spain and France. These wars, ladies and gentlemen, were depicted, and to some extent even theorized, by he who we can consider as the first modern historian, the Italian Guicciardini, in his La Storia d'Italia, History of Italy, which also formed, these wars also formed the background of Machiavelli's Principe, of Machiavelli's The Prince. The Prince, the essay, a short essay, I invite you to read it if you want to understand our contemporary politicians too, was dedicated to Il Magnifico Lorenzo. You can see it on the cover page of this edition, one of the very first editions of the book. The Magnificent Lawrence was not the first one, but the third, Lorenzo II. Lawrence II of Medici. Machiavelli invited this ruler of Florence, who was the son of the original, the really magnificent Lawrence. He invited Lawrence II to reunite Italy as a prince, thanks to his virtù, his bravery, his courage, his leadership capacities, to unite Italy by expelling the barbarians. The barbarians were the Spaniards and the French, all the foreigners were considered to be barbarians, and to some extent, culturally speaking, France and Spain were backwards when compared to the Italian Renaissance. Anyway, the problem for Machiavelli is that no such a prince emerged. Lorenzo Due de' Medici died in 1529 at the age of 1529 or 1519. That's at the age of 27, as far as I remember. And therefore, the war opposed in never-ending battles the Spaniards and the Italian allies to the French and their Italian allies. A cycle of war. The different battles were separated by periods of ceasefire, but not of peace. And ultimately, the Spaniards won these battles, though the French won the war, though the French won some significant battles, notably the Battle of Marion, in French town some 15 kilometers southeast of Milan, won by François Ier, the then French king. But the Spaniards won the whole war, and it was in 1559. This is the reason why some historians consider the wars to last up to 1559. It was in 1559 that the peace treaty was signed between the French and the Spaniards, the Treaty of Cateau-Cambrésis, a town in the then Spanish Low Countries, France recognizing its defeat. And Spain thus became the first prevailing power in the history of the modern international system. Question then, I think we may ask, is why did Spain manage to be successful? I would say two main reasons explain this success. First reason is located in Europe. It is located here. The Spanish king who succeeded the couple of the two first kings and queens, king and queen, that is to say Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabel of Castile. The Spanish king who succeeded was, in Spanish, Carlos I, Charles I, who was born in the Low Countries, which at that time were Spanish territories. Today's Belgium. He was born in Ghent, a city in today's Belgium. It was a part of the Spanish crown because of the then dynastic ties between different families. So Carlos I was a member of the Habsburg family. And in 1519, he was elected emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. The Holy Roman Empire was elected by all the principalities of said Holy Roman Empire. And this was due to the conception of Europe as a kind of commonwealth. So all the rulers, all the European rulers could contribute to it, could be candidates. And therefore the French, François Ier, also applied to the throne of the Holy Roman Empire. But it was Carlos I who was elected by the Italian and German or Germanic entities of this Holy Roman Empire. And thus he became Charles V. From the Germanic perspective, he was Charles V. From the Spanish, he remained Carlos I. So being elected emperor, ladies and gentlemen, Charles V controlled beyond Spain all those territories controlled by Vienna, that is to say today's Austria, plus today's Czechoslovakia, or Czech Republic and Slovakia, plus the southern part of Italy, because the Kingdom of Naples and the two islands were controlled by a member of the Spanish family and Spanish crown, and also the Low Countries, that is, say, today's Netherlands, today's Belgium, today's Luxembourg, and even some territories that nowadays are part of France, up to Franche-Comté in the eastern part of France. So on the European continent, thanks to these territories, Spain obviously was powerful. The first reason in Europe. The second reason was to be found overseas. As a matter of fact, not merely did Spain control Europe, directly or indirectly, thanks to Vienna, Spain also was at the head of the empire where the sun never sets, el imperio donde nunca se pone el sol. That is to say, Spain indeed managed to conquer gradually during the 16th century more and more territories overseas, and first and foremost in the Western Hemisphere. So, and this is the reason why 1492 can be considered as a starting point as the worldwide international system. Spain managed to conquer these territories thanks to what was called, I found this in Chauvin's Empires of the Week, thanks to what the Spaniards called encomienda, the system of the encomiendas. That is to say, private sailors, private adventurers, such as Christopher Columbus, followed by conquistadores, conquerors, which also were private individuals, were authorized by the Spanish crown to conquer militarily different territories in the name of Spain. So these territories became Spanish territories. And the deal consisted in permitting these adventurers, these conquerors, to exploit the territories and thus to make money. So it was a private-public undertaking where, of course, the perspective of becoming rich, thanks to the gold and the silver found in these territories, the private conquerors, the private sailors, were sure to become rich. A kind of public-private undertaking, which was imitated a bit later by the French, by the Dutch, by the English, with their so-called East India and West India companies, or the Hudson Company in Canada. I even wonder whether nowadays, ladies and gentlemen, the Chinese expansion, the One Belt, One Road initiative, somehow reproduces a kind of similar model, because the Chinese firms that invest economically in Africa or in Central Asia along the One Belt, One Road initiative, the Silk Road, the new Silk Road, are politically, of course, controlled by the Chinese authorities. The major difference, of course, is that there is no military conquest of the territories where the Chinese invest economically, of course. So there is a huge difference nevertheless, but maybe there are some kind of common points. Anyway, Spain managed to gradually conquer, we'll come back to the details in a few minutes, the huge territories, notably in the Western Hemisphere, but also in the Far East. Spain, however, was not the only European power eager to conquer territories overseas, eager to discover and successful in discovering unknown territories. The Portuguese did so too. You know that the first sailor to sail around the globe was a Portuguese. It was Magalhães in Portuguese. You know, may know Vasco da Gama, who was the first to sail along the African coasts around Cape Cod and reach India. So Portugal was a very significant rival to the Spaniards, who had appealed to Christopher Columbus in 1492, who was a citizen of Genoa, an Italian entity, and who had been financed by Isabel of Castile, Isabel the Catholic, and Ferdinand of Aragon, in order to reach the eastern part, the eastern coast of India, in order to find gold and silver that were needed to finance, ladies and gentlemen, the war against the Muslims, against the Ottomans. Okay, but as you know, he did not reach India or the eastern coast of India. He reached a new, at that time, unknown by the Europeans, territory, that is to say, the Western Hemisphere. The name of America, ladies and gentlemen, you know that, comes from another Italian sailor, Amerigo Vespucci, who landed in America, in South America, some years after Christopher Columbus. So let's come back to Portugal. Portugal was a very significant rival of Spain, which amounts to saying that just as Spain had to take into account France on the continent, at least until it managed to defeat it definitely in 1559. So Spain had to take into account Portugal in its overseas undertakings. And Portugal, to some extent, was even a more delicate rival, competitor. Why? Because Portugal was as Catholic and therefore as supported by the Pope as Spain. While France did fight on the side of those Italian units that were opposed to the Pope, and since therefore the Pope almost automatically was an ally of Spain against France, the Pope could not be an ally of Spain against Portugal, because Portugal was also spreading the Christian faith, the Catholic faith, and Portugal, just as Spain, recognized the authority of the Pope. So the Pope had to remain neutral to some extent when it came to decide who in the Spanish-Portuguese race overseas, the colonial conquest, who was to prevail or not. So what did the Pope, the then Pope, do? He tried to find a kind of compromise, and this compromise was the so-called papal bull adopted in 1493. The papal bull's name was Inter Cetera. You have the name on slide number 13. A bull is a decree, a decision that has authority. And the Portuguese and the Spaniards recognized the Pope's authority. This still tries to prove that the hierarchical principle at that time was still somehow prevailing, at least in the perception of the Spaniards and the Portuguese. Though to some extent they also wanted to get rid of the Pope and themselves be the most Catholic unit. Anyway, the bull called Inter Cetera decided to draw a line, an imaginary line from the North Pole to the South Pole across the Atlantic Ocean west of the Azores Island. It is the dotted line that you can find on this slide, on this world map. That is to say, the Spaniards call it the raya, that is to say, a line of demarcation, a dividing line. And according to this decision, to this papal decision accepted by the Spaniards and the Portuguese, all the territories that were to be discovered west of this line were supposed to become Spanish territories, while all the territories that were to be discovered east of this line were supposed to be controlled by the Portuguese, whoever the discoverer. This first line, the dotted line on the map, was moved westwards a bit later, ladies and gentlemen, 1 year later, in 1494, in a treaty called Tordesillas. Tordesillas is a town in Spain, in Castile, not that far away from Madrid, from Salamanca, from Valladolid. And the treaty was signed between the Portuguese and the Spaniards. Here you have a picture of this signature. The line was moved westwards, very exactly 370 leagues. That is to say, a league is worth, no, 370 leagues means 2,200 kilometers roughly westwards. And you see here that this second line across the Atlantic Ocean goes through what nowadays is Brazil. And this explains, ladies and gentlemen, why Brazil is a Portuguese-speaking country, while the rest of Latin America is Spanish-speaking. The eastern part of Brazil is east of the line, whereas all the other territories and nowadays countries, be it Mexico, be it Peru, be it Argentina, be it Colombia, Venezuela, etc., are west of. So this explains why the vast majority of Latin American countries became Spanish, were Spanish colonies before becoming independent, while one of them, Brazil, was a Portuguese colonial territory. 1494, the Treaty of Tordesillas. 1529, a new raya, a new demarcation line was drawn on the eastern part of the globe. That is to say, across the Pacific Ocean, east of Japan, of China, and the territories east of this line, because since the globe is a sphere, this means west of the line of Tordesillas were Spanish territory, was supposed to be Spanish territories, whereas the ones west of this line, east of Tordesillas, were supposed to be Portuguese territories. This explains why in today's Indonesia, we had an island where populations spoke Portuguese. The island concerned became independent some 20 years ago, a bit more than 20 years ago, Eastern Timor. We'll come back, ladies and gentlemen, to the significance of these lines in our second part, because they give us an idea of how the then Western powers, then Western elites, perceived the rest of the world. The rest of the world were just territories to be conquered and populations to be converted to the Christian faith. They were not considered to be genuine, independent, sovereign units or entities. We'll come back to this. Regarding the material dimension, of course, though Spain and Portugal agreed upon this division, the French, the Dutch, the English refused to accept it. But at that time, I would say in the first half of the 16th century, they did not have power enough to oppose this kind of division of the earth between the two then major naval powers, Spain and Portugal. That said, and I come back to the Spanish-Portuguese rivalry, the rivalry did not last very long, for the very simple reason that Spain very quickly prevailed over Portugal. The Portuguese were too weak. Portugal was even temporarily integrated into Spain from 1580 to 1640, the so-called Iberian Union, before becoming definitely independent. And it became definitely independent thanks to an alliance with England. And the English-Portuguese alliance, ladies and gentlemen, is the oldest still existing, within NATO nowadays, it is the oldest still existing alliance of in the history of international system. It goes back to 1373. So the English-Portuguese alliance has been lasting for 6.5 centuries nowadays. So Spain became gradually more powerful than Portugal, even once Portugal became independent. Spain, therefore, did not really respect the demarcation lines. The Philippines, if you look at the map, the Philippines are in the Portuguese part of the world, but the Philippines were conquered by the Spaniards, who to some extent refused to respect what they had signed, the Treaty of Saragossa. And much more important, of course, the Spaniards managed, and this explains their power, to conquer huge territories in, I'm looking for the map, in the Western Hemisphere. In 1511, the Caribbean islands, Haiti, Jamaica. Haiti was called Hispaniola at that time. Jamaica and Cuba became Spanish colonies. Mexico was conquered by Cortés in 1519. Neil Young, the Canadian rock singer, rock star, wrote a song called Cortés the Killer, if you are interested in listening to this song. The Inca Empire was conquered by Pizarro in Peru, today's Peru, in 1524. So thanks to these colonial conquests, of course, Spain managed to outweigh Portugal and to outweigh France, and thus it became the first predominant power in Europe and in the history of the international system. That said, this Spanish preeminence, which earned Charles V the title of the new Charlemagne, he was hailed the greatest emperor since the division of Charlemagne's empire. This Spanish preeminence cannot be considered to be a unipolar system, nor can it be considered to be a hegemonic system. What is the difference, ladies and gentlemen? This is important, between a unipolar system and a hegemonic system. The two terms are close, but there is a significant specificity of each of them. Unipolarity merely means that there is one power materially prevailing. So the unipolar structure means that in the system there is one power, major power, and the other ones are secondary by definition. This system is hegemonic if the preeminence is recognized, accepted as legitimate by the secondary powers. In this case, unipolarity is completed by hegemony. Okay, so Spain at that time was materially prevailing, but not sufficiently to be a unipolar power. That is to say, the gap was not that huge in comparison to France, to Portugal, and a bit later to the British. We'll come back to this, to the Dutch. And of course, all the more so, should I say, France, the Dutch, etc., did not accept the preeminence of Spain. Spain's predominance, to put it differently, was challenged and put under pressure throughout the whole period. The Spanish possessions were huge on the planet Earth, and regarding Europe, though significant, they had one weakness. They were scattered over the whole Western European continent. There was no territorial continuity between Spain, Spanish Netherlands, the various, and notably South Italian territories. So once Spain got rid of the French, definitely defeated in 1559, and of the Portuguese, it was challenged by new powers. The Ottoman Empire in the Mediterranean Sea. If you look at the map, you see the huge territory controlled by the Ottoman Empire. Only 100 years after the conquest of Constantinople by the Ottomans. So the Ottomans controlled the eastern part of the Mediterranean Sea. They were eager to expand their own territories. They conquered the Balkans. They besieged Vienna 3 times They supported the pirates that were operating in the Mediterranean Sea from the North African ports such as Tripoli, Algiers, or Tunis. And they attacked, of course, Spanish commercial ships. So this Ottoman challenge was met with success by the Spaniards when they defeated the Ottomans at the Battle of Lepanto in 1571. So the Spaniards also managed to get rid of the Ottomans. But they also had to cope with the Dutch. The Dutch are those inhabitants in the then Low Countries that formed the so-called United Provinces. United Provinces, why? Because they chose the Protestant faith, as opposed to the southern part of the then Low Countries, that is to say, today's Belgium and today's Luxembourg, who remained Catholic and therefore loyal to the Habsburgs in general and to the Spaniards more particularly. The Dutch Protestants no longer wanted to accept the Spanish or the Habsburgs' authority, being Protestant. So they tried to get rid of, started a war of independence, which of course was a challenge to Spain's preeminence. And the Dutch managed, also with the help of England, to get rid of the Spaniards and to maintain their independence thanks to the 30 Years' War that was to break out a bit later. We'll come back to it in a few minutes. The then Dutch United Provinces became today's Netherlands. Dutch was supported by the English, and the English then were logically the last competitor of Spain. The English supported the Dutch against Spain. They had supported the Portuguese, or they went on supporting the Portuguese against the Spaniards in order to weaken the Spaniards. Why? Because England gradually became a naval power. It had expansionist ambitions overseas. And England managed to defeat the Spanish fleet. The Spanish fleet, so-called Armada, the so-called invincible Armada, because of its, or thanks to its victory against the Ottomans. Actually, this victory had also been possible thanks to the contribution of Venice, whose ships had been very efficient in the fight against the Turkish or the Ottomans' ships. Anyway, the British fleet, also helped by British privateers such as Francis Drake, who became Sir Francis Drake, managed to defeat the Spaniards in the Spanish-English battles that took place in the Channel. And the most important one, the definitive victory of the English, then Queen was Elizabeth I, was the battle in Gravelines, today a town in France, at that time a town in Spanish Netherlands, in the Spanish Low Countries. So the Spaniards were defeated by the English. To sum up this point, ladies and gentlemen, the rivalries that the Spaniards had to cope with throughout the century and a half, going from 1492 to 1648, to sum up these points, no sooner had Spain triumphed against the French and the Portuguese that it had to cope with other, and thus its decline started. This decline, ladies and gentlemen, basically was due to two sets of reasons, domestic ones, but also international ones. The domestic reason, first one, was a political one. Only the first successor of Charles V or Carlos I, that is to say Philip II, was an efficient ruler. He is the ruler of the Spanish golden century, Siglo de Oro. His successors, however, did not live up to the situation, maybe with the exception of the Prime Minister Olivares during the 30 Years' War, but Spain at that time was no longer that powerful. Within the Habsburg family, it was Vienna who had become the most important a part of the Habsburgs. We'll come back to this. So a political domestic reason, the somehow poor capacities of the ruling elites of Spain. A second domestic reason was economic, but it is all at the same time domestic and international. Spain suffered a relative economic decline, relative compared to the rise of the Dutch, the French, and the English. Why? Because of its mercantilist policy, because of its mercantilist economic policy. Spain's economic policy, and the same was true for France at that time, was a so-called mercantilist doctrine. That is to say, the then mercantilist economists believed, or Chrétien, to some extent Montaigne even, believed that, and their Spanish equivalents, believed that to be rich, countries had to import gold and silver from exterior colonial territories, because by doing so, they increased the amount of money, the stock of money that they were controlling. And indeed, Spain benefited from the huge flow of gold and silver that came from Latin America. But in satisfying with this economic policy, Spain, to some extent, did not try to improve its economic productivity. And this is precisely what the French, and above all the Dutch and the English, did. So their economic growth started accelerating at the same time when the economic growth of Spain was stagnating and even relatively decreasing, at least comparatively to the Dutch and the English and even to the French. Spain was economically had an economic slowdown of its growth rate. This is the so-called uneven economic growth law, emphasized by the British historian teaching in an American university, Yale University, one generation ago, Paul Kennedy, in his book, The Rise and the Fall of the Great Powers. This is the French translation. And Paul Kennedy adds to this economic law a purely international military strategic reason, what he calls imperial overstretch. Imperial overstretch means that a power, in this case Spain, has huge territories possesses huge territories and must defend them. Now, as I already mentioned, there was no territorial contiguity between Spain, its European possessions, and all the more so its overseas possessions in America. So while Spain was stronger than each of its challenges taken individually, it was forced to turn from a struggle against one of them to a struggle against another one, to a struggle against the third one, etc., etc. A temporary ceasefire with France was succeeded by a war with the Turks. The victory in the Mediterranean Sea was followed by sea battles in the Atlantic. A provisional solution with England did not resolve the upheavals that Spain was coping with in the Low Countries, etc., etc. To use the metaphor of Paul Kennedy, page 49, Spain resembled a bear in the pit, more powerful than all the dogs attacking it, but never able to deal with them at the same time, and gradually getting exhausted in the process of fighting against each of one successively. So logically then, ladies and gentlemen, a kind of power shift occurred within the Habsburg family. The Habsburg family was controlling both the Spanish throne and the Austrian throne, which itself was controlling the Holy Roman Empire, that is to say, roughly today's Germany plus today's Czechoslovakia. So within the Habsburg family, Vienna became more powerful than Madrid, or should we say El Escorial. The palace of the Spanish king was located in El Escorial. Madrid was not at that time an important city, significant city. Austria was characterized by territorial contiguity. It controlled the territory around Vienna. So this distinguished it positively from Spain. But Austria had its own weakness. The Holy Roman Empire that it was controlling, though being territorially contiguous, was divided into many entities, and more important, it was divided into entities appealing to two different religious faiths. Catholicism on the one hand, Protestantism on the other hand. And it is this religious quarrel, ladies and gentlemen, which sparked off the 30 Years' War that was to begin in 1618. Here we have a map of the religions in Europe. Before the 30 Years broke out, you see that the Catholics are constitutive of the majority in Spain, in Italy, of course, in France too, in today's Austria, Hungary, and Poland, and Lithuania. But the Protestants became more and more important, notably within the Holy Roman Empire, and of course also in England and Scotland, in the Scandinavian countries. The 30 Years' War, ladies and gentlemen, started in 1618. It was due to the will of the Vienna Emperor, the member of the Habsburg family, to forbid the rulers who had adopted the Protestant faith, to forbid them to go on practicing it. That is to say, the Vienna Emperor wanted to impose the Catholic faith as the only official religion in the Holy Roman Empire. And some of these rulers that had adopted Luther's doctrine refused, and thus the war broke out. It broke out in 1618. The then German or Germanic entities that had adopted the Protestant faith had done so on the basis of the Peace of Augsburg. The Peace of Augsburg had been a peace that had been signed in 1555, and it had permitted the different entities or the different rulers of the German Holy Roman Empire to choose the religion that they wanted. So to remain Catholic or to become Protestant. So the Emperor of Vienna's willingness to impose the Catholic faith upon those who had chosen Protestantism, of course, was perceived by these Protestant rulers as a step backwards, and therefore they refused. So the war broke out, and at the origin, logically, it was a religious quarrel. We could call it an ideological one, a civil war to some extent within the Holy Roman Empire. But very quickly, this civil war became an epic great power struggle, to quote Lascaret. Why? Because all the then major European powers intervened. And therefore, we have here the second cycle of major wars after the first one. The first one, the wars of the Italian Renaissance. The second one, the 30 Years' War. And you see that both lasted more or less 30 years. The same will be true for the wars of the French Revolution and of Napoleon's empire. And the same will be true for World War I and World War II, considered together as one cycle of major wars, for 1914 to 1945, 31 years. And if you look at the syllabus, you see that precisely, I consider these major wars as the starting point of new historical periods. Let's come back to the 30 Years' War. It began as a religious quarrel, but all the then major European continental powers, England, remember what I said, offshore balancing, did not intervene at that time. It did not feel threatened by what happened on the continent. So the major powers intervened. Spain, first of all, because as a member of the Habsburg family, it, of course, logically, and as a Catholic entity, it supported Austria. And the Protestant princes of the Holy Roman Empire became received as allies first Denmark, then Sweden. The Swedish ruler was Gustav Adolf. France, the then French ruler was Cardinal Richelieu. The king was Louis XIII, but the effective ruler was his prime minister to some extent, Cardinal Richelieu. And the Dutch also joined this alliance because they were fighting, of course, against the Catholic Spaniards. The aim, ladies and gentlemen, of these powers supporting the Protestant entities of the Germanic Holy Roman Empire, the aim that they pursued was a political one. It was not a religious or an ideological one. The 30 Years' War was a total war. 1/3, ladies and gentlemen, of the German population died, directly or indirectly, due to the diseases, etc. Famine, the widespread famine and the diseases. Regarding international relations as a discipline, the war is important precisely because of the motivations that convinced France, Sweden, etc., to intervene. And these motivations were clearly of political nature. The continental powers wanted to grasp the opportunity of this war to definitely weaken the Habsburgs, the Spaniards, and also the Austrians, since the Austrians had become more powerful within the Habsburg family. They wanted to defeat them in order to weaken them, in order to force them to abandon any claim, any ambition, any hope to control the whole of Europe through its control of the Holy Roman Empire. Listen to Las Curettes, page 61. What Sweden, and especially, I come back to this, France, feared in the early 17th century was not religious or ideological in nature. It was political or geopolitical. They feared territorial and political encirclement by a hegemonic power with universalist claims to authority across all of the Latin Christendom. The Latin Christendom, to use the term of the Middle Ages, and that was still acknowledged to be legitimate by the Catholic Habsburgs and therefore by Austria. So Sweden and France wanted to get rid of this Austrian ambition by defeating Austria. This was first and foremost the case of Richelieu. France was at that time more powerful than Sweden. Richelieu, ladies and gentlemen, was a Catholic. He was a member of the church, Cardinal Richelieu, so he was himself a member of the Catholic elite in France. The French king was the very Christian king, as opposed to the very Catholic king of Spain. And despite this fact, and despite the fact that Richelieu in France repressed without any mercy those French people who adopted Protestantism, France had its own religious quarrels, almost here in the southwest of France. Despite this religious Catholic faith, Richelieu became an ally of the Protestant entities, of Protestant Sweden, of Protestant, of the Protestant Netherlands. What does this mean? This means that France, and the same was true for the other ones, was guided no longer by religious considerations, not even by dynastic considerations, but by the reason of state. What Machiavelli will call la ragione di Stato, the reason of state, what was to be called the interest of state. And what nowadays, ladies and gentlemen, our politicians call the national interest. The national interest to which Biden referred in his speech on August 31 when justifying the withdrawal of American troops from Afghanistan. Our national interest does not consist in practicing nation building in Afghanistan. It consists in containing, I quote substantively, it consists in containing re-emerging Russia and emerging China, our national interest. This term national interest, the political discourse of the national interest, goes back to Machiavelli as a theorist, a philosopher, to the Cardinal Richelieu as a practitioner. The reason of state, the interest of state, the national interest, the vital interest, the security interest is more important than any other consideration. Listen to Kissinger, page 22. Richelieu invented the idea that the state was an abstract and permanent entity existing in its own right. Its requirements were not determined by the ruler's personality, family interests, or the demands of religion. Its guiding principle was the national interest, following calculable principles, that is to say, a rational interest of cost and advantages was undertaken before policy decisions were made. These policy decisions had as objective the satisfaction of the national interest. Richelieu saw the turmoil in Central Europe, the religious quarrel, not as a call to arms to defend the church, he was a Catholic, but as a means to check the imperial ambitions of the Austrian Habsburg. And in doing so, Richelieu perfectly put into practice the doctrine of Machiavelli. What had Machiavelli said? A prince cannot observe all things for which men are appreciated in everyday life. He has to take political decisions, and therefore he is, I quote, often forced to act contrary to faith, to friendship, to humanity, to religion, if he wants to maintain his state. Mantenere lo Stato, to maintain one's state, the reason of states, to maintain the ruler's domestic authority, and to maintain the state's external security, requires virtù, bravery, from a prince, and more specifically, to undertake actions that may consist in decisions contrary to faith, to friendship, to humanity, to religion. The state's interest is more important than ethical values, than religious considerations, than legal rules, than even domestic political interests. So the 30 Years' War, ladies and gentlemen, marked the definitive turning point or period, the definitive evolution from the kind of transition period that our period here still was to the modern international system. As long as Spain and even the Habsburgs were dominating, the period was a transition, because Spain, though de facto independent from the Pope and from the Holy Roman Emperor, nevertheless acted in the name of the Christian faith, in the hope and the belief that it would recreate a Latin Christendom in whole Europe. and therefore it accepted negotiations with the Pope and the Pope's decision. This will definitely change after 1648. There were no more links between religion and politics, between the Christian religion or whatever other religion in Europe, I mean, of course, and politics. This was thanks to France's and Sweden's victory in the 30 Years' War. Their victory permitted to get rid of Austria and to get rid of the imperial principle that the Austrians were still defending at that time. So Europe in 1648 will be composed by gradually consolidating territorial nation states. The two treaties were signed, one in Münster between France and Austria, the other one in Osnabrück between Sweden and Austria. Austria recognized its defeat. Spain did not sign the treaties. It refused to participate, and it went on fighting against France. But it was definitely defeated in 1659. It was defeated in today's Belgium. It was defeated in Catalonia, and therefore the French have a French Catalonia distinguished from the Spanish Catalonia, the other side of the Pyrenees. It is in 1659 that the so-called Treaties of the Pyrenees was signed. This treaty definitely broke Spain's back, and it paved the way to a new period, the period of 1648 to 1815. This period will be characterized by the Habsburgs, I would say, progressive decline. Austria remained still a somehow significant continental power. Spain no longer was a major power. France emerged as the predominating power, first and foremost during the second half of the 17th century, thanks to the new king, the Sun King Louis XIV, Louis XIV. But France's preeminence and France's expansionist policy will be checked by the British, who have similar ambitions, not in Europe, but overseas. So the next period then will be characterized by a struggle between the French and the British for the mastery in Europe. This struggle was favorable to the French at the beginning and definitely favorable to the British, the English and to the British actually after 1713. We will see this, of course, in our chapter 3 next week. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for listening to today's class. I hope you'll be back next week, of course, and I wish you a great day. Goodbye.